Mhm. Do you ever play with Mason?
I have, yeah.
Did you beat him?
Oh no, he's really keen. That's his main sport. I at least have
Yeah.
sailing as an excuse for why I'm no good at golf. No,
Yes.
he's a real keen being.
Yeah.
He's good too.
Hmm.
Where are we? We're starting? Oh, we can start now.
Yep. Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our second instalment of our Zoom Room series tonight with Phil Jarrett as our speaker. I'm now going to pass you over to Stephen Wall, who is the chair of our Squadron Speakers Committee and friend of Phil's, and he will introduce him and set the scene for us. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Francis. Well, welcome everybody. I must say it's a thrill to have a guy on a Zoom room chat that he seems to get paid for things that we would pay for. He's had the most wonderful career in journalism and then in business with surfing activities into retail, surfing clothing and all sorts of stuff like that. He's traveled around the world. People paid him to go around the world and file copies. One of those journalists that can write underwater, sober or drunk, late or early. There's not very many of them as far as I know. I've known a few in my life, and they're remarkable people because they can whip out 1,000 words that you could be jealous of. They're so well put together, and it's effortless for him. He was, as he's going to tell you, he's got a book out called The Life of Brine, which I think is one of the better puns that I've probably ever seen, because it's so apt and so accurate and yet horribly punny. But he's sort of going to show us through that book, I think. Is that fair to say, Phil? Slowly, but and add a bit here and take a bit away. So I don't think I should ramble on much more. I think I should just let Phil take over and tell you about his life in the Brine.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. This is going to be a bit messy at the start. So just before I move from this to a little video clip that we did in conjunction with this book, I just want to thank Stephen Wall for those interesting words of introduction. Look, of all the introductions I've had in my long and glorious career, I have to say, Stephen, that was the most recent. That's about all I can say. You made me sound like a bloody t-shirt salesman, which I never was. But my illustrious career will be unfolded as we explore the life of Brine. And so I'm just going to, as I said, it's going to get messy for about a nanosecond here, and then all will be well. I'm just going to change from this into a video mode and put the full screen on. Don't take any notes of what's on my screen if you can see it. Here we go. This is a little 1-minute video we made primarily for Instagram use a couple of years ago when Life of Brine first came out in the Australian market. There you go.
This is the one about the guy who grows up on a coast that has everything. From endless beaches to belching smokestacks. Hangs out with post-war migrant kids who learn to surf before they can speak English. He's not bad at school, better at the beach. Then surfing takes over. Becomes a scumbag journalist against dad's wishes. Travels the world looking for surfing excitement in all the wrong places. Washes up at Whale Beach and scores a job at Trax, the least disciplined surf mag in the world. Meets a girl, falls in love. Then come the kids, the mortgage, the real jobs, and the expensive booze and middle-class drugs. Writes a book, then another. Soon he can't stop. Edits skin bags, works on TV, sells his soul to the big surf brands, starts the world's biggest surf fest, hangs with the big shots, thinks he's one of them, and suddenly, he's fat and 50. And then along comes surfing. Remember me? Longboards, grandkids, happy times. He remembers why he married the girl he married. It's just one surfer's journey. And it's not over yet.
Okay, wild virtual applause, if I can hear all over the neighbourhood. And I'm just going to get rid of that sucker and put it back onto the slideshow. or perhaps I should say the Magic Lantern Show. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the 19th century Magic Lantern shows, but they were wonderful. And, you know, beautiful glass slides. Whoops, hang on, I've got to find that. There we go, full screen mode. Explorers and people like that, adventurers who'd done all these wonderful things, used to show Magic Lantern shows, and everything went really well until the machine blew up and usually caught a light and often burnt down the building. So hopefully tonight we don't burn down the virtual building and everything goes well. Welcome to the Life of Brine, which is the webinar of the book of the same name. And if you haven't already guessed, I've never done a webinar before. In fact, the way this event was conceived, after many gin and tonics, I must say, and an evening of leopard shooting with cameras, not guns, of course, in Rajasthan last November, with the illustrious Stephen Waller, as we know him, Wall. It was supposed to involve me coming to Sydney, having a jolly old time with all of you at the squadron. And then along came COVID and buggered everything up. So here we are in our living rooms or our offices looking at computer screens. So we're going to make that as interesting as possible under the circumstances, and thank you for joining us tonight. The overarching theme of this webinar, and I hate that bloody word, was to be the connection between surfing and sailing. Which, apart from the fact that you have to be in the water to do it, doesn't really exist. And you should understand from the outset that I know virtually nothing about sailing, but I was very good friends with someone who did. Ian Kiernan was a really good mate who I first met when he was about to do the BAC challenge back in the mid-1980s, and subsequently we wrote his life story together in the 90s, leaving out a few bits to protect the guilty, I guess you could say. That was the cover of our book, Coming Clean. Somebody said we should have called it What a Load of Rubbish after his instigation of clean up Sydney Harbour and then clean up Australia and finally clean up the world. After the Sydney to Hobart in 1994, Kiernan gave me the one and only decky job I've ever had. And that was given to me after I passed a rigorous test involving frying eggs at a 45-degree list and passing him the Cascade dog beer whenever he whistled as he was steering the boat. Here we are on the Maris, working on the book. Dog beer's just out of shot. And down below there, the shot below, it turned out that Kiernan knew the bloke who was allegedly running the country at the time. So we took him for a walk on lonely Balmoral Beach and told him that we didn't really need to have that recession that he said we needed to have. And he was all ears for a moment. Look, lastly on Kiernan, I loved him like a brother, a big brother. And when we farewelled him about 18 months ago now, the last drinks of a very long day were had at the bar of your delightful club. As I said, it was a big day, and it was an appropriate finish, I thought, to our celebration of the life of one of Australia's greatest sons and also one of Australia's great sailors. So that's enough about sailing. Let's talk about me. Okay. I was born just up the road from this house at the top. You can see at the top there, at the Bulli Hospital. But that's the place that I spent the first 10 years of my life, a place my mother called the house from hell. And if you look closely, you can see the bunting on the paling fence out the front, which was in honour of the young Queen Elizabeth, who drove right past our door on the royal tour of 1954. I was about 2.5 at the time, so I don't have a clear memory of it, but it was a pretty important event for that old house, I can tell you. It was a complete dump, to be honest. Mum was right, but it was right in the middle of the CBD of a suburb of Wollongong called Corrimal. So Dad was able to sell it as a knockdown for a good price, and he built this cream brick dream home up in the hills overlooking the smokestacks of the Port Clember Steelworks, which was also twice as far from the beach as the first house we lived in. But, you know, these are first world problems. Shot down below shows me and my two sisters, along with a wonderful woman who became my third sister. And no, Dad didn't bring a little surprise home from the war. Our third sister, Toshiko Kojima, was a wonderful exchange student, and my dad was a very devoted Rotarian, and he was one of the pioneers of the international exchange student of the late 1950s, came into being. And in those post-war, immediate post-war years, there was a lot of prejudice against having Japanese kids involved in it. He just didn't understand that logic, and did his best to overcome it. And we had one of the first intake of Japanese students ever in Australia come and live with us, not once but 3 times during her student year. She felt most at home at our place, so she kept coming back, and she kept coming back all her life. She's now in her 70s. She's still a close family friend, and when both my parents died, she came back to Australia for their funerals. Okay, Dad was in the retail game, obviously, and he ended up with a string of shops selling everything from hearing aids to travel. Sold a lot of Women's Weekly adventure trips, similar to the one that Stephen and I were on in India last year, I think, but maybe a generation or two before that. This was where it all started for him. This first shop back in the 1940s, just more or less immediately upon arrival in the Illawarra region. He rented the premises, and although it seems really odd today, it was designed to a plan. Push bikes on one side, electrical appliances on the other. Like, who would have thought? But in fact, it was the norm back in those days. And in fact, Melbourne Star, the bicycle company, actually had a model floor plan for retailers, which my dad apparently followed, because in the bottom photo you'll see the white goods and the radiograms on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side all the push bikes. Pretty weird. What was even weirder, as far as we kids were concerned, was that when television came in 1956, Dad put a little microphone outside a TV set in the window, and everyone in town, including his own family, because we weren't allowed to have one at home, would come along and park their folding chairs on the footpath outside and watch Crusader Rabbit and the nightly news. No matter how cold it got, there would be a bunch of people out there freezing with blankets over them while they watched Crusader Rabbit. Who would have thought? Okay, real going surfer boy, it says, and that's what I became. Mum and Dad thought the beginning of the 1960s was the beginning of the end for me. I thought it was the beginning of life itself. Surfing just took over. And the shot in the middle is of my first mentor in surfing, and I had many. A guy called Bobby Brown, and that the photo there shows him surfing my home break in 1964. He went on that year to surf in the world titles, the first ever world titles in Manly, which were won by Midget Farrelly, and Bobby made the final. He finished 5th out of 6 in the final, and for a young teenager, that was a sterling effort. He was an enormous influence on my surfing, because before I had a surfboard, he was an apprentice with his dad as a carpenter up in the Cronulla area, but he would come down to the Wollongong area sometimes after work during long summer evenings, always on the weekends, and surf at our beach. And before I had a board, he would loan me his board. And my earliest memories of surfing are of the great Bobby Brown pushing me out through the waves and showing me how to stand up on the board, and even showing me how to stand up as I pushed through the boards on the way back out, which I thought was a very cool trick. And down the bottom, that was all the good side of surfing. The other side of surfing was that I became a delinquent quite early on, and the scene for Friday night underage drinking was the Bellambi pub, classic old pub. It no longer stands, but back in the day, it was a beautiful piece of architecture, and also a very great place for underage drinking, because the cops never came there and nobody seemed to care. Now I I started my my crazy exploits as a drinker there when I was about 15 or 16, and I remember probably my greatest memory, and one that stuck with me ever since. I heeded the words of the barmaid who called me over one evening when I was drinking one of my 12 port and lemonades, which you could buy for $1. They were 12 cents each. So, you know, I'd go out with $2, $1 to get me into the dance afterwards and $1 to drink at the pub. And I could have 8 port and lemonade for 12 cents each. That was a pretty good deal. And 8 did the trick. And one night, the old barmaid called me over to the bar and she said, do you ever see any old people drinking this port and lemonade that you like so much? And I had to admit I hadn't. And she said, there's a good reason for that, Sonny. Go to beer. And I heeded her advice. My guts have thanked me ever since. And I became a beer drinker. But that's another story. Moving along. And there's no room for modesty in this webinar, is there, Stephen?
None whatsoever.
I was pretty damn good at school, which was just as well because I was also a smart ass who paid absolutely no attention in class. And I was never there, in fact, if the surf was any good. In fact, when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in 1969, which was my last year of high school, I missed the whole damn thing because the surf was pumping. Just snuck into the assembly hall where they had about half a dozen little television screens for us to try and watch. Just snuck in for the Buzz Aldrin bit at the end, you know. So it was a bit disappointing from having missed this huge piece of history, but the surf was really good. So that's me up the top there in my interview suit. Dad wanted me to be a diplomat, but clearly that was never going to work. A diplomat I was not, and a diplomat I am not. So we compromised on me applying for a Qantas marketing cadetship. And that's me dressed up for the Qantas interview in my best slacks and very, very cool Italian casuals. I think I had a jacket that plopped over that shirt. Anyway, it was all completely wasted time and money, getting dressed like that, buying the clothing, because I would never normally wear that stuff, because I didn't get the job. They didn't want to know about me. So I became a journalist, and my father was not particularly happy about this. All he knew about the newspaper industry was going into the filthy newspaper office at the Illawarra Mercury to pay for his meagre advertising bill, and seeing all these sort of drunken yobbo journalists heading for the pub in the middle of the day. So he thought that was not a fit nor appropriate profession for a son of his, but I felt otherwise, and I got my own way, and I became a journo. I first of all joined the Sydney Daily Telegraph as a copy boy. And after a little while, I was accepted on an intake of cadet journalists with the Sydney Morning Herald, and started there and had a lot of luck early. I was mentored by quite a few people, including the features editor, a guy called Guy Morrison, who took a liking to me and allowed me to travel at company's expense to Byron Bay. To write an expose on the rising surfing and drug culture in that town, and this is in 1970, when nobody really heard about. You know, everybody down south thought Byron Bay was where meat and butter came from, and you know, there was a long pier out there, and apparently one day it had been a whaling station. That was about all anybody knew. But there was a kind of nefarious community in the hills, which later morphed into more of a hippie thing, but in those days it was mostly surfers. I was a true surfer, and I'd shown some talent in it, but I was also a journalist. And this was the first indication that I ever had that the two were going to conflict in my life. And I went up there and wrote this article, spoke to the local coppers, put my tie on, you know, went in and saw the cops, and they took me out in a four-wheel drive vehicle, you know, a very old troop carrier or something, I can't remember, or a Jeep, and up and down all these hills, and showed me all these shacks where surfers were living, and he said, taking drugs, and showed me a few plants out the back that he claimed were marijuana. I didn't really know. Anyway, I wrote the story along those lines. and it annoyed a lot of my friends who were just happened to be drug taking hippie surfers, and it kind of got me my first feature. But I really kind of regretted in later years. I regretted having been such a turncoat on my own kind. Anyway, the next year after that, that was 1970. Like 18 months later, I was given the opportunity to work in the political sphere, and in the great year of 1972, when so much was happening, when I was on the line, I'd already been my marble had come up. I'd been conscripted, but deferred because of my journalism and my university studies, which never came to fruition. But in 1972, I was in Canberra. I was right in the heart of things. Gough Whitlam's campaign was carrying on like crazy. It was a very exciting time to be a political reporter. And the Aboriginal Tent Embassy was built sometime during the lead up to that election. And that's Gough, with Kep Enderby, the local member, who I worked for very hard during the campaign as a volunteer. Because if Labor were to get in December 1972, then conscription was going to be ended, and I was off the hook. That's what happened. I was off the hook, and so guess what? It was time to say thank you, journalism. You've given me a great few years, but now it's time to go to Europe. Like all surfers and like all people of my generation, I think we baby boomers just really lived for the moment we could chuck whatever it was that we were doing, chuck that in and travel. While some people, worked it out better that they could travel for their livelihood, travel for their occupation, I didn't have my life worked out so well. So I just quit my journalism job and just took off with the money I had for Europe with a mate. And unfortunately, almost immediately after the obligatory short time in London, and sometime doing a little bit of work on the beaches of Cornwall as an ice cream boy, and working in boarding houses and cleaning floors and whatever, just so I could surf for the summer. In the autumn of that first year in Europe, 1973, I took off for France, and discovered in the top shot there, you'll see a beautiful, beautiful part of the world called the Pays Basque, the Basque country of the southwest of France. And that particular shot shows the village of Guétary. And we spent most of the autumn around that village. And in later life, I was able to go back and live there for a couple of years. So Guétary's always been a real place in the heart. Another place in the heart that started with that trip was the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And we traveled, my friend and I traveled with some other people in a van for about, until the winter got too biting, basically. Towards the end of autumn, we left France and headed south, believing that the water would be warmer down there. In fact, it's the reverse. The currents mean that the water in Portugal is much colder than it is in France all year round. We didn't know that. But here we are, free camping in Peniche in Portugal in 1973. And that young lady is checking us out as we try and set up camp. And we're always pretty hopeless at this, trying to set up a tent next to the van and so on. She was a young Dutch woman traveling with her New Zealand-born husband, and unfortunately, my friend and I both became very attached to her and caused all sorts of ructions in the free camp. But now I'm friends with the husband. I don't see Maria from Holland anymore. She is still alive, but her then husband has become a good mate, and every time I get to New Zealand, I catch up with him. That was Europe in '73, a wonderful, wonderful experience. Another place in the heart, and this started in 1974, and Bali in those days was, nothing like the Bali of today, and I'm sure there are some of you tuned in tonight who perhaps have experienced Bali in one of its gestations over the last 50 odd years that it's been a tourist destination. Well, my friends and I basically followed in the footsteps of a guy called Albie Falzon, who made a film called Morning of the Earth, which was released in 1972. I was there just 2 years after Albie's film came out, and we all went there primarily because of the waves we'd seen in that great seminal surf film. But
you on the wave, Phil?
Sorry,
Is that you on the wave?
that's not me on the wave. I wish it was. That's the great Jerry Lopez. That's me. That's me down. It was hard to get good pictures if you were just a normal surfer. You know, there were a few heroes there, and they were the ones that got all the shots. A friend of mine took that photo of Jerry Lopez, who was a famous Hawaiian surfer, and he came in the early years. He came every year for 2 or 3 months, and we would spend a lot of time out on the Bukit Peninsula, which is where both these shots are taken. In those days, we had to walk about 2 or 3 kilometres. I'd say 3 kilometres from a little tiny village compound, and that's where I am in the bottom shot with my board, ready to hit the track down this really rough track down to these days there's a road that runs right around that coastline, but in those days it was a long trek in, and when you got there you stayed all day. But we got to know the families that lived out in that very arid peninsula. Still know some of them today, and I have to say that first year in Bali set me up for a lifetime love affair with Bali, even through the tumultuous times ahead, and the rather sad state it's been in over the last couple of decades, with rampant tourism, overdevelopment, and hideous pollution, water pollution, and other kinds of pollution. Hopefully, they're on the way back. There are some really good signs and some really good movements, even by the provincial government, towards making Bali a safer and cleaner place. But I still go there every year. I still love it dearly. Okay, so the following year, 1974, by the end of 1974, I was back in Sydney, brokenhearted, long story, won't go there, broke. Well, you can guess why. I've been traveling too much and working too little. And the bloke I just mentioned, Albie Falzon, the guy who made the film Morning of the Earth, was also one of the 3 founders of a magazine called Tracks, which reinvented the idea of a surf magazine when it first came out in 1970. And I became a contributor almost from the beginning, but I always did it from afar. I'd be in Europe and contributing an article, or I'd be in Canberra contributing, political nonsense that, coming from a 22-year-old or whatever I was at the time, it wasn't very well thought out. Mungo McCallum was much better at it than I was, but anyway, I gave it a crack. I'd been a contributor through all those issues you can see in front of you, which preceded me. And I'd met John Witzig, who was the editor in those years, and he became a good friend and another mentor. But I hadn't met Albie. And one day he came to see me at the newspaper that I was reluctantly working for, the Murdoch's Sunday Telegraph. He came to see me and introduced himself, and I was absolutely thrilled that Albie Falzon had sought me out in my newspaper office, and we went for a lunch on Elizabeth Street, a very trendy little brasserie called L'Oignon, and I drank a couple of bottles of wine while we ate our lunch, and he offered me the editorship of Tracks. I couldn't believe my luck. I think by this stage I was 20. It was the end of 1974, so I was 23 years old, and going on 24. I really didn't think that the editorship of a magazine like this, which was, doing really well by this stage, it was selling about 10 or 15,000 copies, and it was to reach a peak of about 60,000 towards the end of the 1970s. But in those days, that was a lot of copies, and it had a future. It had ads, and it looked really good. So I was offered this job. I moved to Whale Beach, rented a house up above the beach on Norma Road for $35 a week, and I thought I was in heaven. A new chapter of my life began. And one of the big things one of the most important things about being the editor of Tracks was that every year you had to go to Bali, and you had to go to Hawaii. And I think Stephen mentioned in the introduction to me that a lot of my life has been spent having wonderful travels on somebody else's dime. Well, this was one of those occasions, but it was also it was only barely enough to cover expenses over there, and sometimes I had to dig into my own pocket to pay for the beers. But these photos kind of depict the life in those that we had in Hawaii on the North Shore of Oahu in those early years. It was also simple back then. You know, the professional surfing tour had only just begun. It was in its infancy. The money was very small. The top shot shows a friend of mine called Bernie Baker's rented house on the beach right at sunset. And this is where all the big contests were held. And this was actually during the World Cup at Sunset Beach in 1976. And that's the Aussie team, all sort of sitting on Bernie's deck there. And somewhere in the back, I'm clustered with a couple of beers and a ciggy on the go. You know, we all smoked in those days. We would have wonderful times. But the great memory that I have of those years as covering the professional surfing contest is that everybody who was there was losing money, myself included. You know, by the time you had a good time in the nightclubs of Waikiki and paid your rent for, you know, whatever hovel you were staying in, there was no change out of it. And the world's leading professional surfers were competing for a prize purse of usually less than $1,000 US. And so no one was rich. We were all in the same boat. Today, of course, the Kelly Slaters of the world, travel in a completely different stratosphere to the rest, and the Mick Fannings and so on. But in those years, there were no rich surfers. We were all just shit kickers, I guess you could say, if you'll pardon the expression. And we were all in it together. And we were all trying to make it work. Now, one guy who wasn't in that camp at all is depicted in the photo below with his girlfriend at the time, a guy called Bunker Spreckles, whose name I managed to misspell. He was the heir to the Spreckles sugar fortune, which was considerable, which began in Hawaii many years before, but a century before. But spread all over the world. Spreckles Sugar was a huge US company at the time, and he was, I guess, he was the black sheep of the family. But he was also the stepson of Clark Gable, the actor. So Bunker, wherever Bunker turned, there was money for him to spend, and spend that he did on fast cars, fast women, and booze and drugs. And this was. About this photo and the interview I subsequently did with him was about 3 weeks before he died of an overdose. Right there at the actually it's at the hotel, which has since been remodeled, where, if you remember, Scott Morrison decided to take a holiday just as the bushfires were starting all over the East Coast. Well, same hotel. Bunker had a cabana there for the winter, for the northern winter. And that's where he died of an overdose at the beginning of 1977.
That's a classic case of die young and have a good-looking corpse.
Well, he was 27, and the magic number of 27, or the devil's number of 27, where so many rock stars seem to get that far and consider that was, die young, leave a good-looking corpse, as you said. Yeah, Bunker, a very tragic life, interesting life. He's been kind of immortalized in books and in a documentary that I contributed to some years ago. I can't really understand why. There are a lot better role models in surfing, and here's one of them. Different kind of role model, but a role model nonetheless. That's me on the left in the top shot. Again, that's in Bernie Baker's yard at an event in Hawaii in the same season of 1976. And next to me is a guy called Peter Drouin, who was one of Australia's greatest surfers of the 1960s into the 1970s as well, from Queensland. He didn't win a world title because for most of his career there was no professional world title, and Peter was more interested in making money than winning at an amateur level. He was a very interesting character, and I spent a lot of time with him in those days. And I could never quite work out what was going on in his head. He was a strange dude. in later life, we discovered there was a lot going on in his head. He became a lawyer for a start, and an actor. He went to NIDA. Very intelligent man. He seemed to be capable of turning his talents to virtually anything, including becoming a woman. And in the shot below, you'll see him in his mode of westerly windina, and this shocked the surfing world absolutely to the core. We had no idea that this was going on, but Peter had decided at some point in life that he'd always wanted to be a woman. He'd never been able to express it, and now in late middle age, he decided that he would become westerly windina, and he went to Southeast Asia and had the appropriate measures taken, and physically became a woman. Then, classically, Peter Drouin, he decided that he wanted to become a man again, and the operation, of course, is irreversible. But by this time, he was in his mid to late 60s, and his lawyer and good friend said, "Pete, we're both 69. We don't need that appendage anymore." And hopefully, Peter has been able to manage to accommodate the fact that he's a man again, but he's a man minus. Very interesting character in Australian surfing. Okay, so along come the 80s, and in October '79, just ahead of the 80s, I got married to the woman who is still my wife, Jackie, a wonderful lady who I met at Whale Beach while I was the editor of Tracks. And she had 2 children by previous marriage, so I actually inherited a family. And we also we had 2 more of our own. And the 80s, oh God, how can I, if you weren't there, you can't, it's like the 60s. The 80s was a very excessive time, I think it's fair to say. And for me, well, initially, having moved on from Tracks to I thought probably further my career, I was offered the editorship of Australian Playboy in its very early days after the departure of the founding editor of Australian Playboy, Mark Day, who moved on to start Penthouse. Mark and I were great friends, and I think he put in a good word for me, and I became the editor of Australian Playboy. But I also, again, after he left the position of editor of Australian Penthouse, I followed him in there too and became the editor of Penthouse. So I spent in all about 5 years in what we referred to in those days as the skin trade. And while it's true that most people bought those magazines for the articles rather than pictures, it was a time of incredible excess and big hair, as you can see. I had to wear a suit again for the first time in over a decade. That's me wearing a suit, and that's my bride, Jackie, with the big hair. And down below, you can see us being excessive on Lake Como. And on the left there, my great friend, Rennie Ellis, great photojournalist and film director, and I took all the Penthouse pets from one year on a trip to Fiji to make a short feature for in those days Roadshow and people like that would actually put money in for short features to show with their major feature films. And I guess they had an Australian content thing, so it was easy enough to go to them with the idea of, how about we take the Penthouse pets to Fiji and photograph them in the nude in all different funny situations. Today, Screen Australia would laugh you out of the shop, but in those days, no problem. And so we made a short 20-minute film called Pets in Paradise. There were lots of adventures like that during that period, and it's a period that I don't resile from. I don't try and deny that it was part of my life, but it is hard to kind of justify those publications. They did carry a lot of good journalism, but the way they treated women, and the way we treated women as editors and writers within them, and photographers, was pretty tragic. So I'm going to move on from those bad old days to the family. this was concurrent with all that bad stuff happening. We had a growing family, and we were living on Sydney's northern beaches, mostly at Avalon. We bought a nice house in Avalon, and that's us having fun as a family. It was that was a time that I have no regrets about whatsoever. The 1980s might have been excessive in many ways, and certainly there was a lot of drug adventures that I wish, a lot of detours there that I wish I hadn't taken. But you know, the family kept everything rolling along. And also during the 80s and into the early 90s, another thing that kept me on track and rolling along was friends and mentors. And I mentioned Rennie Ellis a minute ago. Rennie and I worked together on so many projects through the 80s and 90s. I did a lot of books in that period, and Rennie worked with me on several of them. That's him down there on the bottom right, and me in a very silly looking safari jacket. I can't remember why. On the left-hand side, my great friend, my Europe traveling companion back in 1973, and my business partner in a company called Jarrett Jamieson. His name is Neil Jamieson. He's a very well-known writer himself. He's written quite a few good books. And together, we both graduated into the world of television, which takes us to the photo up the top. My mentor in sports television was a guy called David Hill, not the one who became managing director of the ABC, but the other one, who was a lot more approachable than that one, and also a bit of a larrikin. David Hill reinvented cricket back in the 70s for Kerry Packer, for World Series cricket. Things we take for granted today, like shooting, having cameras at both ends, daddles, the duck, all those things were his invention back in the day. I met him in about 1977 when he turned his attention to 79, when he turned his attention to surfing contests and how to make them work on commercial sports television, and we've been friends ever since. He got me and Jamo employment at Nine's Wide World of Sports, and I spent most of the latter part of the 80s working for the Bulletin magazine part of the week, and over at Artarmon at Channel 9 for the other part. And that's us that's Peter Feynman, the director of the Crocodile Dundee first film, and a great variety producer. That's me with Hilly in the middle, celebrating his 50th at a cigar bar in Beverly Hills some time ago, I might say. Great years. Okay, in late 1989, David Dale, who was then the editor of the Bulletin, took me to lunch and said, "Do you know anybody who would be able to take over the position of the Queensland Correspondent for the Bulletin?" Because our Queensland Correspondent, Quentin Dempster, is moving to Sydney to take up an ABC appointment. And I said, "Well, what about me?" And he said, "Why do you want to move to Queensland?" And I said, "Well, you know, Noosa for one thing, proximity to Byron Bay is another thing. But I'll take the job as long as I don't have to live in Brisbane. If I can live within a 2-hour striking range of Parliament House in Brisbane, I'll take the job." So he went away to think about that, and he came back and he said, "Yeah, Trevor Kennedy has said that's okay. You're on." So I became the Queensland Correspondent of the Bulletin. Drove up there, bought a nice little house in just out the back of Noosa, and enjoyed my time working for the Bulletin there. It was a very exciting time, actually, to be working in Queensland politics, because the remnants of the Joh Bjelke-Petersen regime, which was it represented 25 years or more, I think, of LNP reign, the conservative rule of Queensland, had been toppled by Wayne Goss's win in 1989. And Labor had come to power with a bunch of young people, Wayne Swan among them, another one who he didn't like because he wouldn't have a beer, and he had tickets on himself. A guy we called Dr. Death, his real name was Kevin Rudd. Anyway, apart from Kevin, everybody else in the Goss camp was really cool, and I enjoyed very much working with those guys. And some great stories emanated from the early Goss years. There were some disappointments later, but there were certainly some wonderful times during Wayne Goss's first couple of years as Premier of Queensland. And I was there for that. At the same time, I joined with a couple of friends and created Noosa's first lifestyle magazine, which we inadvisedly called the Noosa Tatler for the first 2 issues, which you can see in that top shot. The London Tatler didn't think it was very funny and sent us cease and desist. And so that came to a screaming halt. And so we renamed it Noosa Blue, again stealing the name from our mate Ross Renwick, who had a publication called Billy Blue, which many of you will remember fondly. So, you know, we were just plagiarists all the way along, but Noosa Blue took off and we had 10 great years. While this is all happening, I don't know whether you can see it clearly, but the photograph, the cover there on the right-hand side shows a quite young lady. It shows my boat behind her, by the way, my little Noosa boat. She's holding an undersized brim, and that's Yvonne Goolagong Corley, who had moved to Noosa so that we could, she and her husband Roger had moved their family to Noosa so we could work on a project that we'd been working on since the late 1980s, which was a book called Home, the Yvonne Goolagong story, in which she was going to track her Indigenous roots and, you know, rediscover the places she knew as a child and contrast that with her career as one of the legends of tennis. So that was a project that ran concurrently with both the Bulletin and Noosa Blue / Tatler. So I was a little bit busy for quite a few years there, and something had to give, and the Bulletin sacked me. So I deserved to be sacked. I wasn't pulling my weight, but wonderful times. Now, our first office was on the banks of the Noosa River, and we overlooked the fact that periodically the Noosa River floods, and in the great floods of 1992, we lost just about everything that we had in those offices, and including a lot of stuff that belonged to our other office for Goolagong Productions. There it is. That was after it had gone down a little bit, actually. It came through at about desk level, and it took out everything that wasn't in the top of the filing cabinet. So that was a minor tragedy, but we pulled through. The other thing that happened in my early years in Noosa was that I got involved. I really started to become very keen about surfing again. How are we going for time, Stephen? Are we all right?
We're going to have to hurry up.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I'd become very, very involved in surfing again, and at that time I was most enamored of an event in France that I'd been to called the Biarritz Festival of Surfing, where they honoured the Hawaiians every year, made a big pageant of it. So I was able to introduce this concept to Noosa, and we created the Noosa Festival of Surfing. That's me competing in it in one of those very early years. That's me with the microphone up top with all the Hawaiians, looking fairly silly, but that was our traditional opening ceremony. And over time, the Noosa Festival of Surfing became the biggest surfing event in the world. Okay, in late 1999, I was offered a job I couldn't refuse to go back and live in the southwest of France, that I spoke so lovingly of. I was offered the job of head of marketing for the Quicksilver surfwear company for all of Europe, but based in France. And the shot in the middle shows the town square of Guétary, and we had a beautiful little flat just above it with a view out over the ocean. That's my 2 bosses up the top, and that's me on the right down the bottom, handing out the money at the Irish Quicksilver Masters in 2001. So for 5 years in France, I went back and lived there and just had such an absolutely wonderful time. It was a good job. It was hard, but it was something that I really enjoyed. And we're just about done now, Stephen. Back in Australia, grandparents, Jackie and I decided on the eve of the GFC to open a retail store selling all the sorts of things that people buy when they've got lots of money, but they don't when there's a GFC. So that didn't last long. Started going back to Bali more and more often, basically dividing our time between Noosa and Bali. And that all started in about 2012.
Phil,
Sorry?
is that you on that wave?
That's me, yeah. That's me.
Finally got a friendly photographer.
Yeah. Look, I wouldn't want to put too many. I don't want people to go to sleep looking at surfing photos of me, Stephen. There are better things to do. But
Yeah.
that's me up the top with my little Bali kit there, my surfboard and my motorbike. And Bali is still a hugely important part of my life. And another important part of my life, very, belatedly, I had a heart attack in 2014, and my doctors told me that I really had to slow down and do less stressful things. So I decided to become a filmmaker. that turned out to be a fairly big mistake, but it did result in one hit, a film called Men of Wood and Foam that the Foxtel network funded, which was shown throughout Australia and New Zealand for 2 summers from 2016 through to 2018, and resulted in it was about the early Sydney board builders who started the sport, and it started the industry, the sport and the culture of surfing in the 1950s, basically. And that's them you can see arm in arm with us as filmmakers down the bottom. And this led to our most recent work in progress, shall we say, a film called Generation 99 about Timor-Leste. I've spent, my filming partner, Sean and I have spent a lot of time in Timor-Leste in recent years. It's a place we love dearly. And that's us down there with Jose Ramos Horta, the former president and prime minister, a great man, hero of mine for most of my adult life, and now a friend. And that film has struck a few hurdles with COVID, but hopefully we'll see that up and running in cinemas and in film festivals in 2021. Okay, finally, that's us. That's part of us. That's part of the clan. Now I've got, now have three daughters, 2 sons-in-law, and 4 grandchildren, and that's most of them there. And we all live in the same town. We love it to death, and that's a wrap. And so cheers, everybody. Thank you so much for being part of my first ever webinar. Thank you. And if you'd like to buy the book of the webinar, if you can read the print there, it says selling copy $40, includes postage in Australia. The email you can send to is Phil Jarrett, PhilJarratt51 @gmail.com, and just send the email and we'll sort out the payment details as we go, and also the signing details if you're interested in that. Hopefully you'll be in touch, and thank you so much, Stephen. Back to you, and also thank you to the squadron for having me.
Well, Phil, that was amazing. A most enjoyable experience, and this is recorded, luckily, so we can revisit it later on, or for people who missed it, which is always a few people who miss these things. It'll go into the archives of the club. There's a few questions that, if you want to ask a question, now's the time to type it up on, I think it's called chat. But I've got one for you, Phil. I was always I was very jealous of your lifestyle working for Quicksilver.
Yep.
That must have been a really remarkable time. But there was 4 or 5 big surf clothing companies, were there not, or 3 anyway? What happened to them? They all sort of died.
Okay, I'll answer that question. But have I done the right thing here? Can everybody see my?
No, we can see your homepage now. What they call it, the desktop.
You can see that.
We don't
want that. I'll just try and fix that.
Put.
Do I take it off share? Stop share?
Yeah. That's it.
Is that it? Okay. What happened to the major surf companies was the question.
Yeah.
Well, they're still there, but they've and this process has been happening for quite some time, even pre-GFC. There's been a tendency for them not to be very good at succession planning, and the founders of all 3, Quicksilver, Billabong, and Rip Curl, the big 3 Australian companies, are all in their 70s, some in their late 70s now, and they had to move on. They couldn't be doing this anymore. They were running, at one point, they were running multi-billion-dollar companies. Quicksilver got up over $2.5 billion at one point. and you know, the running of companies had to be passed on, and the shareholders were all screaming for that to happen. And usually it happened in the way that that people who were totally inappropriate to run a surf company that needed credibility in that world were brought in, and we witnessed this happening in the big American companies as well. That once the surf brand loses its credibility with its core market, it can never fully regain it, and that's what's happened, I think, with Quicksilver and with Billabong. Billabong's possibly making a recovery to a certain extent. The only company that's avoided that so far has been what was privately held throughout its entire life of more than half a century, the Rip Curl company. It's still, I think it's privately held by the Kathmandu company. I don't think they're public. I think it's a private company. But that sale to Kathmandu is quite recent, and we haven't, and almost immediately following the sale, COVID kicked in, and all the surf companies are doing it so tough it's really hard to tell who's going to weather the storm. But if anybody does weather that storm, it will be Rip Curl. But essentially, the first generation of the surf co's, where the founders still reign supreme, is all gone. It's over, and unfortunately, the sons and the grandsons and daughters, for that matter, of the founders are not the people who are running them.
Excuse me. Someone also wants to know, what was the trip back from Hobart like with Keenan? Big seas or a nice trip?
Bit of both. I mean, we did have a big storm coming around the bottom, and I think the photo that was in my presentation, where we're trying to do an interview with, I've got the tape recorder between us, and the beers are sort of down below. I think that was pretty rough weather. And then later, I also mentioned that I'd become an expert in the galley at, cooking, frying eggs at 45 degrees. Well, that came in handy too, because we were into a nor'easter most of the way up the New South Wales south coast. So we had a bit of everything. But what I do recall of that trip, of that voyage, was that Keenan and I really got to spend some quality time together. We only had one other crewman with us, and he was a good guy, and he did his job. And Keenan and I just sat around and worked our way through his life. Him describing these incredible adventures in such glowing detail that I'll always remember that. And interesting, just one thing about Ian Kiernan, when we were celebrating his wake, or I should say, commemorating his wake at the squadron, I was talking to one of his gorgeous daughters, who told me that in his last days, when Ian could no longer speak, he asked her to read chapters of our book to him. And he just sat there in his chair, laughing his head off. He couldn't make any noises, but his expression was of laughter. He was a rogue to the end. And she said it was just wonderful to see him being able to get such comfort out of that project that was 25 years old when he died.
Fantastic. We better wrap it up now. But before I do that, we've got a message here from Glenn Phillips. Thanks, Phil. Really enjoyed your stories. Along with 4 other mates, we visited Bali in 1981 and found some amazing surf, a wonderful culture, and totally welcoming people. At the time, I recall us wondering what Bali must have been like in the 70s. Now I know. And thanks to you for telling us what it was like. It does look pretty amazing. You were very early in that one. Now, Phil, we'll say goodbye to everyone and to you. I thank you very much for allowing us to hear about your fabulous life. Not that there's a lot to go, but we can have you back for the second round if you could do that for us. But maybe we'll have a live dinner instead of this wacky Zoom stuff. So,
well, I certainly
of the club. Thank you very much.
And thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it immensely. And yeah, next time let's do it live.
Yes. Okay, we'll tune off now.
We'll try.